Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. We've got another terrific episode today, like we do always, and it's just me this time. So hopefully you sit back and enjoy your Monday drive home or wherever you like to listen to Highly Respected, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. And it's just me talking today. The first thing I want to talk about today is something that is very, very, very important, and it's very relevant to what's happening. The Olympics just opened up over the weekend, and once again, everyone's watching the Olympics and getting excited about it and tweeting about it. But there is, markedly less interest in the Olympics this year than in times past. I remember in the Olympics of 2016, everyone's tweeting about it. Everyone's talking about, their favorite athletes. Oh, I love how great they are in this individual sport. And it was the same in the 2018 Winter Olympics. You're noticing a lot less, or at least I am, noticing a lot less enthusiasm for the Olympics. And I want to make this clear. I'm going to put out my clear argument first for what I'm going to talk about the Olympics. Why you should not root for Team USA in the 2021 Olympics. You could put that as the headline, the title of this podcast. This topic is inspired by mainly Trump was speaking in Arizona this week at a Team USA event, and for some reason he got on talking about the U.S. women's soccer team losing to Sweden 3-0. And before the game, they had taken a knee for Black Lives Matter. And the whole crowd celebrated this, and they're all having a good time at the U.S. women's team's expense. And people are so mad that this crowd of patriots, this crowd of conservatives would dare boo the Team USA women's soccer team. How dare they? Do they not have any patriotism? And Hawaii Senator Brian Schatz had in all caps, they are rooting against American sports teams. He was so upset, so flabbergasted that this would occur. And this is actually the correct point because, you could have noticed this in 2019 when you were watching the... I want to know, if you were one of those unfortunate people who possibly watched women's soccer in 2019, that you might not make it. But we'll forgive that. Maybe you were at a bar and you had to watch it. That was the only thing on TV. We'll overlook your mistakes and somehow ending up watching women's soccer. But even if you were, if you're following the news or anything, you're getting the updates on this. And the women's soccer team was so awful in that time. I mean, they were all making social justice protests. When they won the game, I brought this up a few weeks ago. When they won, I brought this up last week in a discussion of, the controversy over the British soccer team and the English soccer team and their fans getting mad at their black players for losing the game. But when they won the World Cup in 2019, the U.S. women's soccer team, the whole crowd, which began chanting equal pay, and the whole point of this game was to demonstrate about the gender pay gap and how women are so much better than men in the workforce. And apparently soccer is just like the regular workforce, and this was a metaphor. And these women bring home the gold, and the men can't even bring home any medals, and they just suck. So why don't they get equal pay? Well, there's a very obvious reason why. Is because fewer people watch women's soccer, fewer people care, they generate a lot less revenue. This is a basic point. I'm not going to get into the gender pay gap. I think most people should have been aware of the truth about this matter in 2015, so I'm not going to belabor the point in 2021. But the whole point about this sport was to advance left-wing ideas here in this country. So the U.S. women's soccer team wins, and this creates a discussion about how we need more legislation to advance and to reduce the gender pay gap and to make women's rights more important in our country, because check out these women. And then when they won, they had this horrible parade where they all tried to perform at this fake machismo. They're we're bros, and it's these ugly short women who are trying to act like men, but it comes off as just fake and inauthentic and just gross. And that's what the national pride is. It's like your patriotism. You're celebrating these lesbians who hate everything you like and hate the traditional America that you see in the flag, and you're supposed to root for them just out of some misplaced sense of patriotism. And you can see this throughout the sport. You have athletes like Gwen Berry, the black hammer thrower, who totally disrespected the flag and the anthem, said it was so rude that they would dare play the anthem while she's on the podium, and that she does not feel represented by the anthem, and she's never felt represented by it because it's racist. And you probably have most athletes agreeing with that. And you also have the U.S. men's basketball team, which also suffered a humiliating loss to France, and I believe they lost to Nigeria in the pre-trials, so they're not doing very well. And this is a whole entire all these guys play in the NBA, which is an entire league dedicated to advancing the Black Lives Matter agenda. They put Black Lives Matter paraphernalia all over their stadiums. They all wore social justice jerseys, usually like declaring like end racism. And you're just supposed to root for these people. Like, these people are not representing you. They're representing the globalist American empire. They're not representing this country. They're not representing its people. They're representing the Biden administration. They are representing the State Department. They are representing the CIA. They are not representing you. Now, some of the individual athletes may, be good. There's could be some, like, there's certainly many conservative athletes or, athletes who are just not woke who are participating, and you can root for them as an individual. But generally, whatever happens with these games, they always highlight more of the minority athletes, much more so than the white athletes. It's like Simone Biles. She is considered the greatest athlete to have ever walked the earth. I mean, she's very good at gymnastics, but like the hagiography around her is just so astonishing and just too much to take in. And she's also not doing well in the Olympics too. Simone Biles, I don't think has made like the type of statements that any of the players on the women's soccer team or the basketball or the men's basketball team have made. But, it's at the same time, she is representative of what the ideal and the aspiration should be for the American people. Is like, you have to see our new heroes as non-white and these representatives of the globalist American empire and the new America, rather than some cisgender straight white guy who is comes from like Iowa, and you're not supposed to see yourself in him because that guy represents the old America. And they rarely, and I mean, Michael Phelps was of course celebrated, but that's just because he was the best at his sport, and that was many years ago. He was in the sport. At all these other players, you're supposed to see in that team the new multicultural America, and all their victories are a victory for diversity. And even Obama in the 2016, when he's talking about all the medals we're winning, he's like, we've got that diversity. That diversity is really, the genetic diversity is really helping us win these games. Unlike these stupid homogenous countries, we've got more diversity, and that's our secret strength. And we always get to demonstrate that in the U.S. Olympics. And now we're not seeing the diversity help us out. Like, it's not doing anything for us. And there was even controversy over, they invited one white player to be on the U.S. basketball team. Kevin Love. He had to go back, and Jalen Rose, ESPN sports commentator, former basketball player, went off about how this is affirmative action, essentially affirmative action for whites, and this guy isn't good enough, and they just wanted to have a white face on what would otherwise be an all black team. And it's a common talking point. Imagine if the races were reversed, of course. If there was like a, Winter Olympics, if we just put like a mediocre black player on the hockey team, everyone would be celebrating that. And like, this is what we have to do. But, the fact that they put a white guy who is maybe not at the peak of his career, but he's still a pretty good player on that team, that's just an outrage that we have any white faces on this team. It should be all black faces. That's what Jalen Rose was arguing in that point. So that's who should represent America, not, these doughy face, corn-fed white boys from Iowa. It should be the people that Jalen Rose wants us to see ourselves in. And this is why, to go back to the general point, is like, this is why you shouldn't root for the USA. As I want to reemphasize this. You're not rooting for your country. You're not rooting for your people. You're not rooting for your real nation. you are rooting for the false nation that's been imposed upon us by the globalist American empire. You are rooting for the empire, and it's like, this is so grand. And whenever they win a medal, they can say, oh, this person has an immigrant background, this person has struggled with systemic racism in our country, and this is why we should fight back against it. Oh, this person is a lesbian or a gay, and this is why we need to do more for LGBT rights. And this is how they always play up these issues. I mean, you could just look at it, what happened with the English soccer team. The whole point that the coach wanted was to show a new, vibrant, multicultural England with his team that included immigrants and blacks. And then, of course, when they failed to deliver, the gold, when they failed to deliver the championship, it became a problem. It was due to evil, racist, white Englishmen. That's the problem. It wasn't the poor performance of these black players. It was you, the English soccer fan, that made them lose. And I don't think they can do that with the American Team USA. But anytime that they win, it's like Obama touting the diversity of our team. That's why we win. And that's why we need more diversity. Because just to look at how great our Team USA is. But the Team USA embarrassing themselves and disappointing and providing disappointing performances, and even coming and not getting the most medals, maybe China or another country getting the most medals, I think is it's a setback for their ideology. It's a setback for what they want for us. They can't argue for all their stupid talking points if they can't provide victory in the U.S. Olympics, when we should have the best athletes. Even regardless, I mean, yeah, we should be winning most of these medals, but if we can't, and it's because they're too obsessed with diversity and they're too obsessed with social justice activism, then maybe maybe that hurts their ability to propagandize onto us with this phony patriotism that comes with the Olympics. I have to say, if you're just thinking about it's my patriotic duty to root for these teams, Dan McLaughlin, who is always my favorite conservative to cite on the show for silly opinions. He's a National Review writer. He's the guy with his face and superimposed on a baseball crank is his handle. He had this tweet where he's saying, oh, I will still root for players that disagree with me. I will even root for athletes that want me persecuted. But as long as they just stand for the flag, or they respect the flag and the anthem, I will. That's the ultimate conservative position. It's even if you want to put me in a prison camp and it helps your argument to put me in a prison camp by you winning the gold, I will still root for you because at least you respect this country. It's no, I'm not going to root for you. That is the cuck mindset. I don't want you to win. I want you to lose because you are an enemy. You don't represent me. I don't see myself representing the U.S. women's soccer team or the U.S. men's basketball team or Simone Biles. I don't see that. This is not people who are going to respect me. That, as they say, they want me persecuted. They want all of us persecuted. So this is not an exercise in patriotism. It's an exercise in loyalty to the gay, to the GAE, and that's what you're rooting for. And you even see it in all these Olympic ceremonies. They're so awful. I just saw clips of it. Who is inspired by this stuff? And I saw so many commentators who are crying over these Japanese singers singing Imagine, and they're singing it in a Japanese accent, so it sounded goofy as is. And the song is terrible. They always demonstrate Imagine as the global anthem. I mean, at several other Olympics they've performed Imagine. They're oh, this is so inspiring. Marianne Williamson, the former Democratic presidential candidate and guru, I guess that's her spiritual guru, was talking about how she's bawling over Imagine getting played at the Olympics. And this is a really powerful song for them. And they always, anytime that there's a tragic event, I remember, after the Paris terror attacks in 2015, there was piano player, does an epic performance of Imagine right by the Bataclan, and it's oh, this is just so to inspire us. And you have to think it's the people getting shot just believe oh, Imagine no nations, no God, no heaven, while the Bataclan terrorists are imagining strongly imagining a God and a heaven, and that's inspiring them to to kill and be terrorists, and you're thinking like, oh, this is how we beat back with terrorists, with this nihilistic tune about how awesome it would be just to have no beliefs and nothing to die for, nothing to fight for. And like, this is a terrifying vision. But that's what the Olympics impose, and that's like what you're rooting for, is like you're rooting for a country to make and imagine as its national anthem when it's there, even though it's on a global stage. But even, looking at when Western nations have their opening ceremonies, they're always just such a joke. I mean, when London had their 2012 Olympics, they had these two mascots that were designed by an ad team that had no relation to like British culture or to like even humans. They were like these what looked sort of like these horrifying mechanic Teletubby things that like you're not sure what they are. They look like something from like a bad anime cartoon, and they don't represent anything for Britain. Everyone hated these mascots. And then the opening ceremony was all about multicultural Britain and like celebrating the National Health Service. You're like, wow, thanks for this is a real monument to the British people, as the National Health Service. And it was just all pop culture references and nothing really in reverence to like British culture and traditions. That was all like downplayed in favor of pop culture and the National Health Service. And that's any time that they're, if we had a Olympics in America sometime soon, that we're also going to see something. It's going to be the most awful thing we can imagine on planet Earth. It's going to be all LGBT stuff, all black. It'll probably just be entirely black, but they'll add like gay elements to it. I guess Tariq Nasheed won't be happy with the buck breaking. But that's what it's going to be. That's our national identity now, and there's no reason to support these. It's no reason to support this Team USA on the Olympics. It's something that I don't connect with, and even I've always found like the phony nationalism, patriotism, encouraged by the Olympics and the World Cup. I just found it completely alien, and the people who really gravitate towards it aren't necessarily like our people. It's not like people in like Alabama are glued to their TV, like wanting to know what Simone Biles is going to do in the gymnastics. They just don't care. And it's the same with the World Cup. The people who are most into the World Cup, watching America in the World Cup, men or women's, is always like these urban yuppie libs. That's the people who are most into it, and it's like these guys who, like it's like a gay. Imagine like a gay club, all in like gaudy, like goofy American, like patriotic, like over the top patriotic outfits, and that's like the soccer fan base watching the World Cup. I remember one time in like 2014 when the World Cup was on, I didn't realize like the USA was playing in the middle of the day, and I went to go to lunch at some restaurant, and I walk in, and it's all of these like horrible libtard yuppie types in there being like, yeah, go Team USA, I love America, I love soccer. And I walked in and I looked at it, I was so like just upset. I'm just like so angry that like my lunch spot was taken over by these people that I just immediately walked out. And I was like, I'm not eating lunch here. And it's something I can't connect. If I ever rooted for that, it's like you're rooting, as I want to make this point, you're rooting for the reigning system ideology. You're not rooting for your people. You're not rooting for your country. You're just rooting for the globalist American empire. And it's pretty good for the globalist American empire to get pie on its face and humiliate itself, despite having, saying how great its diverse athletes are and it has the best athletes in the world. And to see it be upset by, lose these competitions to more homogenous nations that don't build their national ideology and state religion around worshiping, magic Americans, and it's not their patriotic narrative is about overcoming systemic racism or apologizing for slavery. So, and that's the general point. It's like, don't root for a team at USA. You can root for individual athletes, and there's plenty of great athletes, I imagine, in the games, but. And you really shouldn't actually watch the Olympics in general. It's like I've always was bored by the Olympics, even growing up as a kid. I always prefer team sports that are more and that are judged by objective standards, like you score most goals, you win. I was just never. I was like always bored by the Olympics, but I think you really just need to turn this stuff off and not watch it. And whenever you see on Twitter that they're losing, or especially like the U.S. women's soccer team, like really the one team we really need to lose is the U.S. women's soccer team not getting gold, because they are the embodiment of like the gay, and anytime they win gold, it's going to be another a nauseating sermon about like equal pay and diversity, and like how you need to take a knee during the anthem. And if they lose, if they don't make gold, they'll probably, I imagine they'll get a medal. It'd be great if they didn't win a medal. That would be the best thing ever to come from these Olympics. But that should be the main thing you should root for. And also the U.S. men's basketball team to not make gold. Those two things, I think, are the main goals for any serious patriot, because this does embarrass these people who are the most dedicated to social justice and racial justice activism in our country. And if they can't even bring home a gold, that does undermine their efforts. The next topic of discussion I want to get into are really stupid ideas that Republicans and conservatives discuss. I talk about this a lot, but they always come up with new and dumber ideas that I just have to get off my chest on, highly respected. So the first thing I want to talk about is Republicans have gone to war over this is insanely important, over banning Ben and Jerry's. I know that you guys have been hoping and praying that the GOP would finally come down on ice cream, but they are finally delivering. Ben and Jerry's said that they would no longer sell their ice cream in occupied territories, or Israeli occupied territory in Palestine, Palestinian areas, whatever the definition is. So they're essentially going along and supporting boycott, divestment, and sanction efforts, BDS. And this is a huge offense to Zionists and to Republicans. So they made sure to crack down on it. The Israeli foreign minister even pretty much ordered Republicans in no uncertain terms that they have to work to ban Ben and Jerry's. It was like a direct marching order. I think even if Trump gave this order to Republicans, they would have said that that's a little too much. But when the Israeli foreign minister delivers it, they have to listen. And sure enough, they went to work. People like Ron DeSantis demanded, look to ban Ben and Jerry's. So are other state governors, and even some Democrats in New York, for example. They're looking to eliminate Ben and Jerry's from like public, being served in publicly run facilities. All over this, announcement about, not selling their ice cream in Israeli occupied territories, which is whatever. I don't like Ben and Jerry's is a terrible libtard group. They've always supported like Black Lives Matter, even like early on, well before 2020, they were big supporters of Black Lives Matter and delivering messages about systemic racism. And they've always been a liberal company. Even when I remember as a kid, they were a very liberal company. Then it's ice cream. What can you expect? And all these conservatives who always say we can't boycott baseball because, well, we can't make politics run our life. And we can't boycott this certain movie because we can't let politics run our life. We can't boycott, Nike or all these other companies that go woke because we can't let politics determine our life. When an ice cream company criticizes Israel, all those concerns fly out the window. Then they say we must boycott and punish this company because they're attacking Israel. And what it really says is like conservatives and Republicans care far more about Israel than any issue pertaining to America. Because you can see, Ben Shapiro was urging like the boycott of Ben and Jerry's and how he's not going to eat the ice cream anymore. And he's never done this for other, companies that clearly hate him and hate America. He was instrumental in countering the cancel culture that went after the Guardians of the Galaxy director James Gunn. He was, he's always been like, conservatives shouldn't boycott this. This is wrong. This is terrible to do. And we'll talk more about Ben Shapiro in a moment. And so have several other conservatives said that they can't do anything about it. And even if you look at something like the MLB, the MLB, moving the All-Star game was a direct affront to Republican policies and really Republicans' ability to survive. If they can't pass election reform laws, they can't win another election. And the MLB and several other corporations said, we are opposed to this and we're going to punish you for this. And even when like Republican lawmakers were looking at eliminating tax subsidies and other benefits for these corporations who are complaining about the law. Republicans and conservative media, you were so upset that they would get into this. And I didn't see any public opposition to this. Everyone was going along with it and supporting it. And even people like James Lankford who were saying, oh, we're eroding free speech. Like he said this like one day and the next day he's calling for the full ban of Ben and Jerry's. So it just shows, it is like shows how much of a joke American politics are, is that a foreign nation can dictate the political agenda of one party, and that one party can ignore anything important dealing with its own voters and its own ability to survive in our political system, because this is what really matters is Israel, not anything else. It's rather disappointing. And some people, I saw Ron DeSantis as one of the people doing this, and I merely pointed out like, hey, he gets stuff done, and people get really mad when you criticize Ron DeSantis, and they'll just say, what about Trump? Trump did this stuff. And it's like, well, you're claiming that Ron DeSantis is better than Trump, yet he's doing things that, committing many of the same errors that Trump did, and in a lot of respects he's going further. And you're trying to say that that's like, but he's still he's still going to get things done. He's still going to be the caudillo. And you're like, I don't really believe that. So, that's what their priorities are. It's like banning Ben and Jerry's. And it goes along with this other cultural war front. At the same time that they're banning Ben and Jerry's, they're inventing that there's this like cancel culture war against Chick-fil-A. And they always revive this because some students at Notre Dame, one had said they didn't want Chick-fil-A anymore. And I pointed out that this like shows like a vast change in culture now that like, the Chick-fil-A may no longer be safe at Catholic universities, and the university stood by Chick-fil-A. And now like Lindsey Graham and Kevin McCarthy are making this whole big show about how we stand with Chick-fil-A, and the RNC are one of the main Republican arms sent out like a fundraising pitch is like, will you stand with Chick-fil-A with me? And it's like, why do you need like Chick-fil-A can defend itself, and Chick-fil-A is no longer this like serious conservative institution anymore. They stopped donating to these groups that oppose gay marriage. The CEO like made a big show about how white Christians need to apologize for slavery and start scrubbing black people's shoes. Last year during the, and the aftermath of George Floyd's death. And even Chick-fil-A, the company, released a statement after George Floyd's death about how they're going to work for racial justice. And you're like, we want to raise money to defend this like fast food restaurant? It's like, how is this important to American people? But most conservatives don't understand this about Chick-fil-A. They still see it as like representative of them. And, it doesn't really cost Republicans anything, and they're not really doing anything, but a lot of their base intrinsically supports Chick-fil-A, and they're like, will you stand with Chick-fil-A with me? And they're like, sure, I'll donate money, even though like Republicans certainly don't need your money to defend Chick-fil-A. It's just a total bait and switch. And it's like, so in the last week, we saw Republican priorities not defending the people indefinitely detained for touring the Capitol without permission, not doing anything about tax censorship, not doing anything about the federal government starting to persecute people for their political beliefs, not any expansion of the federal government, such as turning the Capitol Police into a domestic surveillance agency. Nothing. They're not really doing too much about immigration or crime or black are making Juneteenth a holiday, making an anti-white holiday, a federally recognized day. Not doing anything about that. Instead, they're focused on banning Ben and Jerry's and standing up for Chick-fil-A. It's just a joke. It's why you shouldn't donate any money to these people. And it's like, why? If you donate money to the RNC, you're just a complete sucker. It's a cow pill. You're a cow. You're getting put in the pen and you're mooing and you're thinking you're doing something by standing up for a fast food restaurant. And it's utterly pathetic that anyone would fall for this stuff. But this is just a bait and switch, and now the culture war that they've switched to is to nothing substantive or anything that deals with their actual voters' concerns or even protecting their people from persecution. It's all like supporting Mr. Potato Head and Dr. Seuss and just stuff that is just like totally goofy and comes with no risk, no real cost, except it just makes them ridiculous to the media, which they are. They're not actually doing anything to help you or preserve the historic American nation. They're just there to raise money for themselves so they can get reelected, so they can continue to do nothing for you. And so that's the Republican scam. Instead of fighting over Ben and Jerry's and standing up for Chick-fil-A, if Republicans were serious, they would do something about the ADL teaming up with PayPal to deplatform alleged white supremacists, or every major tech platform working with the federal government to compile a database on suspected white supremacists and right-wing militias. This is far bigger threat than whatever goofiness that they're focusing on, but they're not going to talk about that because one, they're afraid of the ADL, and two, they they also have to believe that there's some domestic terror threat when there is no domestic terror threat at all. So right now we see that big tech is working with government entities and NGOs that have far more power than the GOP to censor Republicans' own supporters and their own base of people, and to turn our country into basically what is China. As Darren Beatty said, it's China, but it's fatter with drag queens and zero national pride. And that's what they want to turn us into. But we'll all celebrate that this is freedom and democracy because they say that we're preserving democracy by implementing all these authoritarian measures. So I think, when we're looking at the GOP party, I don't necessarily one of those people who's always like, we have to kill the GOP and that's the only way to survive. There's the unfortunate thing that to notice is that without even these vehicles, even how terrible they are and stupid they are, without even these vehicles or pretenses of resistance, people will just accept this. Like, I think you have to realize is, if there's like total authoritarianism, most people just like happily go about their lives. They're not just going to revolt because it's like, oh, I no longer have a party to vote for. Oh, well, like, I'll just focus on sports, or I'll just focus on my hobby. I'll just focus on my model airplanes. That's what they're just going to turn into. They're just going to completely apolitical and just try to phase out the world as much as possible. And we can see this, California is a one-party state. It's not leading to any, interesting off the beaten path political solutions. It's just leading to more shit. I mean, and you can see this in New York and other places. Like a one party state, people just come to accept. I mean, that's the unfortunate, especially if there's economic prosperity. The only reason that they would come to revolt is if they're not able to feed themselves or they're not able to, have basic amenities in life. That's the only thing that's going to happen. And there's always, for right now, there's always going to be a modicum of prosperity or hope for prosperity among people. And yeah, it may require more debt and more, harder to obtain and more insecurity around it. But, you still have more economic prosperity than in other times of revolutionary fervor, such as 1917 Russia or 1789 France. Or even, even in like countries like in 2014 Ukraine, there's far more, economic desperation there than there is in America. And so when people are like, we want to kill the GOP and something else will rise in its place. And, you can see your evidence in California and, the situation just gets worse and more bizarre. But I do have to say it's like, the GOP as a vehicle is, and so is many of all these other like conservative media and etc. that are stupid and not focused on these things. They're still with, if they went away, there's not anything going to be good to replace them. So you have to keep that in mind. But at the same time, you shouldn't be donating to the RNC when they're focused on Ben and Jerry's and Chick-fil-A. You should only donate it to them if they actually have a serious solution to big tech working with the Anti-Defamation League and SPLC and the federal government to silence the middle America. Until they do something about that, they're not worthy of support because that's the real matter. That's the real importance. And that's the real news. And unless they're going to talk about that rather than standing up for Chick-fil-A against some imaginary threat from college students, they're not worthy of your money. But I want to say at the same time that, it's still like these are still vehicles for possible resistance. You just have to turn them into the proper direction. And you only are able to turn them into the proper direction if you withhold your money and support until they actually focus on the important issues. So as I said earlier, I was going to go on to Ben Shapiro. And Ben Shapiro of course, did not disappoint us with his latest silly take. He actually has an incredible idea to depolarize America. All right, here's a tweet, and I'm going to read it in, of course, his voice. If you want to depolarize American society, begin with a simple task. Say publicly that someone you totally disagree with about politics, someone who voted for the other guy, is a nice human being, and people should give them a read or listen. And it goes on to list a lot of terrible people. It's like John Lovett, who like one of the Pod Save America guys, terrible. Larry Wilmore, it's like not even funny. Matt Iglesias is still worth reading. Some other people, Van Jones, terrible. Jane Coaston, who is like conservatives' favorite, like she's like the black lesbian ombudsman of like conservative. She'll like always like fact check and like police the boundaries of conservatism, and she pretends to be a lot smarter than she is. Like anytime she gives like a historical take, she's like, "Yo, I can't believe this," and then it's like totally wrong interpretation of what it is. Like I think about World War One. Is that she's like, yo, did you know that Wilhelm and Nicholas II were cousins? I bet you didn't know this. And it's like, yeah, everyone knows this. And it's also, it was like she said it's like a family feud. It's like, is a complete opposite of a family feud is that both the related monarchs were trying to keep peace, but their systems that they didn't have total control over moved in a direction that they couldn't control. But anyway, very dumb. Don't listen to them. Steven Pinker, I guess, is worth reading his books, not necessarily his Twitter. But some of these names are really bad, and some of them aren't that bad. Jane Coaston might be, and Van Jones are probably the worst. I would say John Lovett are probably the worst. The main point of this is like, that's not how you depolarize America. Ben Shapiro is not making neighbors like each other because he's like, listen to John Lovett or like follow Jane Coaston on Twitter. That doesn't make any like depolarize. And none of these figures are going to say, guys, I'm so appreciative Ben Shapiro giving me support. Give him a follow to follow respectable conservatives. No, they tell you to like follow people who are no longer conservatives, like Jennifer Rubin or David French or David Frum or Max Boot. Those are the people they tell you to recommend. Liberals don't offer this, this carrot in return. It's only conservatives who are desperate for this. And conservatives are desperate to have friends who don't agree with them politically, while liberals don't care at all. Because liberals believe that their politics aren't based on just their own viewpoints. It's based on morals and values. And it's saying that if you disagree with me, that's not just simply disagreeing on like a point of view. You are disagreeing with my values. You're disagreeing with what we as a society should agree is right and wrong. And you are wrong and you're evil and you're a bad person and I don't want you in my life. Conservatives never go to that far, especially the ones who work in conservative movement. While liberals like who are working at Vox or HuffPost, they all follow this line. They don't want to have any friends who are conservatives. I mean, people at CNN, I guess, and maybe some of the network reporters at like CBS and such, they'll be fine with having one token conservative friend. But in order for that conservative friend to be accepted, they have to tone down their views. It's like, well, I'll accept you, but you have to agree on racial justice. So that person can't make any criticisms about Black Lives Matter. And if you make a criticism about Black Lives Matter, you're going to be cut off. You're going to be defriended on Facebook. And I know several people that it's not just people working in political media. There are people who are just like ordinary people that'll say like something negative about Black Lives Matter or say something about Trump, and they'll have like multiple friends on Facebook saying like, you're an evil person, I'm defriending you. And it's a very much difference in how they operate on politics. Like conservatives like think that it's like, people just like reading up on views and coming to their political positions on a rational basis, and people can just all get along because we're all Americans, while like liberals, it's very much driven by morality and what is the common good. And you are violating the common good by holding right-wing positions on immigration or Black Lives Matter or the vaccine or whatever issue you want to say. And the only way to, and they're willing to go to bat for these beliefs. They're not going to say like, well, we'll agree to disagree. They're like, no, I'm going to cut you out of my life and I'm going to make sure that there's a social cost for you having these views. And this is how they dominate society, is because people like don't want to shut up and they don't want to offend people. And many conservatives are conscientious. I think I butchered the way of saying that, but you know what I'm saying. They are more conscious of making sure they don't upset people and they follow along, they follow the norms, they follow the status quo. That's what conservatives, as a mindset is properly be. They don't want to necessarily upset the boat. They don't want to make everything rocky and prone to tip side. They want to keep everything nice and respectful and civil. And liberals exploit this position to make sure conservatives follow their lines. So, no liberal is ever going to say, what, me and Scott M. Greer disagree, but I think you should follow him to really get a different point of view. And none of them are going to ever say that. And they're not going to even say that about Ben Shapiro or any of these more mainstream figures. They have no reason to. And they view their political viewpoints as not just something that they it's their sports team and they can agree to have different sports teams. No, they view it as, if you want to be a good person, you hold these positions, and to not have these views makes you demonic, makes you satanic in our eyes, and I don't want to have anything to do with you. And conservatives just aren't willing to go that far. They want to be accepted and respected by liberals because, liberals have cultural power and conservatives don't, and they don't like the feeling of being ostracized. They don't like the feeling of being outcast and rebels against the norm. And that really grates on people with conservative sensibilities because the average conservative, and if you think about the traditional definition of a conservative, it's like somebody who's going along with the rest of the community and is following the community guidelines and rules and dictates and norms. But now when the community's dictates and norms are fundamentally anti-conservative and anti-traditional, it makes it very hard for these people. And some of them just go along with the flow. But, those who are not as politically educated or as strong-minded or as free-thinking go along with the flow. But the average conservative now, that makes you an outcast. That makes you liable to be cut off by friends, to suffer some social reputational costs. And that means you're just not going to have former friends who disagree with you politically. And for me, that's fine. It's okay, I don't care, I fundamentally have this worldview, and if you don't accept it, that's your problem. But most conservatives aren't willing to go that far, and they're desperate to have liberal friends. And I don't think you necessarily should have, these liberal friends. It has to be the fundamentally twisted worldview they have. Look at how they're covering this vaccine stuff. It's the people who choose not to have vaccines. And they relish, they get so gleeful over this idea of these people suffering and dying because they don't have the vaccine. There's two different viral stories last week that demonstrated this. There was a blonde-haired doctor in Alabama, I think in Birmingham, Alabama, and she told this story that it's likely not true because in her county, for the past 2 or 3 months, their 7-day total for every week has been one death per the one COVID death per the whole county. And a lot of those people that they count as COVID death, they probably they would have brought them in and they're okay, this is a COVID death. And she talked this way, and it's this mock oh, this is so terrible for me, but it's so good. It's I know these people who didn't get the vaccine, and I'm about to intubate them, and they're please give me the vaccine, please. I'm a Trump, and they have to they have a Southern accent. They probably have a Trump tattoo, and they're please give me the vaccine. I'm so sorry. And then she's sorry, too late. You're gonna die. And then it's oh, and then all these reporters this is so awful, but really all these people are so happy that they imagine these redneck Trump supporters are begging in their last moment of life to be redeemed with the vaccine, and instead they're dying. And it's this image of it's a sinner going up to the gates of heaven, and they're being told, nope, you're going to hell. It's and they're please, no, give me one more chance. It's nope, you had your chance, it's over. And then it's these doctors acting as God and damning these people to death for not following the rules, and they really get off on that. And even in this situation, you're thinking redneck Trump supporters, but even that county is pretty black. Birmingham is majority black city, and that county is pretty diverse. And so it's not necessarily redneck Trump supporters who would be the one begging for the vaccine, even though I think this story is made up in general. But she wants to make it understood that it's these redneck Trump supporters who are dying. And there's another story which, once again, they hid the race of this person. This is a black guy who attended a conservative evangelical church who was bragging about not getting a vaccine. He's and he's like morbidly obese, and he had a lot of health problems, and he's like in his 30s, and he died, and all these people are like, oh, you good riddance, you didn't follow the rules, you should have died, and they're like once again like celebrating this man's death. And there's another case of a conservative radio host in Nashville, Tennessee. Actually, a guy I grew up listening to. I mean, my parents always had it on the radio. Phil Valentine. He got COVID. He didn't die, but he had to be hospitalized. He's like, now I'm pro-vaccine, and they're like, love these like. These stories are very much in the same vein of like these moral lectures. In some ways, you would see like past Puritan literature or very Christian literature is like, this man leads a sinful life and something terrible happens to them, and in their final moments they realize that everything they've done is wrong and they've sinned, but they're now facing eternal damnation besides their pleas. And the reason to do this is like a Jack Chick cartoons. The reason to do this is to scare the people who are not near death to return to the faith. But now the faith is like belief in vaccines and belief in liberalism and everything that they say to you, that you have to go along with that. Which, I mean, it's like, regardless of your stance on vaccines, I mean, it is your own personal choice to have it, but it's really, it's not so much that they're not taking the vaccine, it's that they're seen as the political enemy and they're not following the rules that they're imposed, and they want them dead. And it's like what Sam Hyde's old statement is like, they want you broke or dead, and they find it funny. I'm of course missing some key parts of this thing, but that's what the key part of the liberal view is, and that's why you necessarily can't have friends with these people. It's like, you're like, oh, I need to be friends with this person laughing their ass off at this poor evangelical Christian dying because he didn't of COVID, and he had been bragging about not getting a vaccine. It's like, why do you want to be friends with that person? And that person's like is not a good person. They would wish that upon you if you didn't take the vaccine. So it's not. There's a fundamental differences you're going to have with somebody, and there's always been these fundamental political differences. It's like, I always repeat this all the time, is that this fantasy that there is throughout American history that everyone just like could come together, even though they passed their political disagreements, and they could have a beer together and they could talk about their sports teams. This is a post World War II fantasy that didn't exist for much of American history. And if you ever read like pre-Civil War history, and I mean even the Civil War history, that people would get into would kill each other over politics, and even our lawmakers would fight over politics, and that carried on for much of American history. But it was only this Cold War consensus that made the middle class think that, like, okay, I'm a Democrat, you're a Republican, but we can be nice neighbors and have a beer and respect each other. And only conservatives want that back. Like, liberals don't want that back. They know that it's much more beneficial to them to impose these social stigma on their enemies, and those stigma to be enforced, than it is for them to allow them to have like conservative friends be friends with them and allow them to have their political positions. They want conservatives to change their political positions, and they even want them to die if they don't follow their rules, their guidelines, as seen by the relish have with these people who are celebrating those who aren't getting the vaccine. So this is, I think it's like a fantasy. I don't think you should pursue it. I've always said that, and it's like this. It's the same with going with a bipartisanship in Congress, is that often bipartisan ideas are terrible that screw over the American people. I mean, it's like the war in Iraq and amnesty and criminal justice reform, all things we don't want to support, but those are bipartisan. And so I think you want more partisanship. You want more people like agreeing to not hang out with each other because of their political beliefs. At least conservatives should. Conservatives should be more willing to take that risk of saying, I'm going to stand by my principles. And if you're not going to be my friend, you weren't a friend in my first place. Because, a friend would at least tolerate my beliefs or respect them. And if you're not going to respect me for what I believe in, I don't want you as a friend. And more people need to say that rather than kowtowing and trying to moderate their views and placating this rabid liberal who thinks they're more moral and more better than you just to keep them in their friend circle. It's like, you don't have that person as a friend. And so those are my final thoughts on friendship and how you should relate to your on how you should handle this situation. I mean, the final concluding thought is just, there's nothing really to gain by going out of your way to have liberal friends. And I think it is a real sickness and fetish among conservative writers and intellectuals that they have to make like liberal friends just to show that how great they are. And the people who are most obsessed with this are probably the worst conservatives, such as Ben Shapiro. So it's fine if your friends cut you off. I mean, you shouldn't go out of your way to get your friends to cut you off, but I know very many people who make like even moderate positions on like Trump or some other right-wing issue, and then like people they've been friends with for years and years just decide to defriend them on Facebook. So you shouldn't be worried about it. That's one of the costs coming in our society. And if conservatives are more willing to take those costs, that does limit the power of social stunning, shunning, and stigmatization that liberals use to enforce their power and enforce their will upon the American public. So you just gotta grin and bear it. It's tough. I mean, it's how it is. I mean, but like this return to this Cold War consensus is never going to occur. And you really don't even want to depolarize. To go back to the original point, is like polarization is good. Absolutely good. There's no benefit to depolarization, because depolarization means we're all coming together to support the globalist American empire agenda. We're all coming together to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter. We're all coming together to celebrate Juneteenth and to honor the memory of George Floyd. And we're all coming together to, support gay pride marches in Budapest. That we don't want to support that. That's not what we're about. That's not what we want. And the only way that it's possible for something to change and for, this corrupt system to be reformed and to not impose tyranny over our lives is to have polarization. Depolarization means acceptance of the regime ideology. It is the last possible thing conservatives or right-wingers and nationalists want to happen. And I mean, it's not even good for Ben Shapiro's bottom line. I mean, he's like the number one, his page is like the number one shared page on Facebook. I mean, a lot of that is built on polarization. But it's like he wants it a fake polarization that, it's just like you're sharing your favorite sports team content. That's not what we want. We want people to understand that there's something rotten within our system, and people shouldn't accept it. But depolarization and you coming together and having lunch or dinner with your libtard neighbors who think that all white Trump supporters should be put in a prison camp is only leading to you accepting their point of view. It is not leading to them to accepting and tolerating your point of view. And polarization is good. It's a natural offset, because otherwise, if we have depolarization, it's people ignoring the problems or accepting the problems as just a fact of life. And you just got to go on with life and accept how everything it is. And the gay is here to stay. And that's not absolutely not what we want. So those are my final thoughts on that. Now moving along to our cognitive elite questions. As a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me or guests or suggest guests and topics if you sign up for the cognitive elite option at Highly Respected Substack. And that's at highlyrespected.substack.com. This one comes from Jack. He's got 2 questions today. So let me read the first one. The first one is, he asks, this is following along my discussion on pornography and whether, the debate over banning it. He says, on the discussion about the legality of pornography, I agree with you that there wouldn't be much success pushing for an outright ban. With that said, why do you think more activists and politicians don't call for a mandatory age verification on these websites? And he goes on is that we have age verification for, if you want to buy alcohol or tobacco or a whole host of other products in a store, you have to prove your age. And I understand that point, but I mean, we've always had age verification on websites. I remember when I was like a kid and I was wanting to go, I mean, this is pre-social media platforms. This is like early 2000s. And if you wanted to go check on a website, on like a video game website that was like rated M, you had to enter your age to go and visit this like video game website. So if I wanted to go like to check, I was like, oh, I'm interested in this Max Payne video game. I want to go see like what's the gameplay and what's it about. And like I would have to go and you'd have to enter your age to look at Max Payne 2 website. And I would just lie, be like, okay, I was born, yeah, I'm 20 years old. I'm like 11, yeah. So, but I would go on anyway. There's no, and I think I want to reiterate my point from last week is that it's more important keeping a free and open internet than it is to make these measures that may possibly limit the distribution of pornography. And I want to emphasize is like in an ideal society we would ban porn. We want to discourage people from watching porn. We want to make it hard to distribute porn, and we want to, do everything possible within reason to limit its spread. And I understand, and the mentality behind wanting to ban porn is good, and it's something that we agree with. But as from a pragmatic standpoint, our bigger issue is keeping a free and open internet. And anything that makes it harder to access websites will be primarily used against us, not against pornographers, because there is a greater moral stigma against us than pornography. All these liberals who have control and power over the federal government and are going to be running these agencies looking at what's obscene material are going to care more about hate speech than pornography. They're not going to care. Any powers that you give them, they're going to be used as like, oh, VDare.com is publishing obscene material about immigrants. We can't allow that. We're going to censor that. And that's what they would use that as the pretense and the precedent to censor dissident thought. And any type of push for this also exposes you to a hypocrisy charge. And people shouldn't. I mean, people, all right, who cares about the hypocrisy? But at any point that you're saying that, like, I'm pushing to ban social media, or to tell social media companies that they can't censor political thought or dissident thought just because they find it obscene. At the same time, I'm pushing for internet service providers and others to ban pornography because I think it's obscene material. That is going to open up the charges to, oh, that's stupid. And some conservatives may agree. It's like, okay, we'll ban porn in exchange for banning hate speech. And that is a horrible trade-off because in any scenario, they're not likely going to ban porn, but they will ban hate speech, and they will go after it far more zealously than they will after porn. So this like age verification, and it's like, it's requiring sites to do more to follow federal government, protocol at a time that the federal government is working with these big tech companies to censor our thought, and that just gives them more power to do things. It'll be like, oh, you pass this bill saying that we have to, fully verify who these people are. Well, then anyone who reads, let's say American Renaissance, has to verify their identification before going in, and they would love to have this power. So now every person who's ever visited these right-wing dissident website, now they have the IDs of all these people. And also you don't want to necessarily like make websites, especially pornography websites, have to put in the identification, especially with the hacking problems we have. I mean, the one problem is we have all these boomers who click on, and Gen Xers who click on every spam email, and then they give their access away. So like, say all these identifications are stored in this database, people putting in their identification, having to verify who they are, and then it gets hacked, and now all these people have like the identification to tons of minors who are trying to access a porn website. Not an ideal scenario, and this could easily be used against any website that they deem obscene, and they consider right-wing hate speech far more obscene than pornography. Pornography is used to dumb the senses and to make people accept the way of life that they have. It's like, okay, my life sucks. I don't have a sense of meaning. I don't have a community. I don't even have an identity. But at least I can go home and jerk off to like this hardcore pornography I found on Pornhub. Like, society wants that. They're like, that's good. That's good. As long as you're being content, you're smoking weed, you're being a loser. You're no threat to us. We like this. They use it to numb the senses and to make people somewhat happy just for a brief moment, in order for them to accept this corrupt regime we live under. And we should limit pornography and its spread and look at existing law. But I'm very worried about expanding laws to do that, because I know how the system works, and I know that the system cares, and the people in charge care far more about hate speech than they do about pornography. And any effort to make it harder to access pornography or limit who can access it on the internet will be primarily used as a pretext to go after people limiting hate speech. And that's the unfortunate fact, is unfortunately pornography debate goes along with the free expression debate, and we have to defend free expression and free internet regardless. And that does come from a pragmatic standpoint of that for right now, we just can't worry about banning pornography or limiting it. And I think the method that Jack suggested, if it was used on an internet website, it would be open to abuse, and they could apply it to our websites, and it could be a way not only for hackers to identify people who are accessing not just pornography websites, but dissident political websites, and to or the federal government having an access to that database of people. And it'll be a fear factor too. If you have to access, Ameren, and they ask for your identification to prove you're R, I mean, they could use any pretext. We have to make sure you're 18 years old to view this obscene website. It's a factor that's not going to make you want to click on that website. It's going to make you turn away because people don't want to, for obvious reasons, don't want to give their identification away on the internet. So I want to reiterate this point. I mean, I think there are some laws in the books that can be used to limit its spread, but ultimately our main focus needs to be about defending free speech and keeping a free and open internet. So that's the first question. The second one's pretty interesting. He asks, when it comes to fitness, why is it that weightlifting/powerlifting attracts more right-wing people, whereas it seems left-wing people gravitate towards biking, running, and calisthenics? And he's basing this on BAP and Physique Friday and some. And he's saying that even the non-political lifting accounts seem to be pretty right-wing. Now, this is an interesting point. Now, the simple scientific factor is that endurance training is shown to lower your testosterone, and lower testosterone is, scientific studies show, is equated to having more liberal political viewpoints, while having higher testosterone is associated with right-wing viewpoints. I mean, this is not in the case, not every libtard is low T, even though most of the soy jacks we see on Twitter are, and not every person in the right-wing politics is a high T giga chad. We know plenty who are not. But it is just there is, hormonal explanations for a lot of reasons that people have this. And if you're, running does lower their testosterone. There's one study that they're trying to prove it doesn't. And they're elite marathon runners have high testosterone. Well, I think all elite athletes have higher than normal testosterone. That's just the fact of the matter. It's a lot, athleticism correlates with high testosterone. But even when I was I ran cross country in high school, I really enjoyed long distance running, but even then I could understand that these long distance runners were lacking a certain type of masculinity, and they're very low T. They're hey, what's going on? They're there. They're not very aggressive. They're just kind of hey, I just like running. And it's, of course, cyclists are the same. If you ever see somebody, a cyclist, you're just I really don't like these people. And the average cyclist is just a massive libtard. And I think it is correlated with hormonal. There was a great article that Steve Saylor wrote some years ago. This may have been 8 or 9 years ago. This was a long time ago I read this. In this article, he compares the actors Mark Harmon and Gary Sinise. And at this time, they were both stars of popular network dramas. And Gary Sinise, if you guys don't know, is a pretty conservative actor. He was Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump. And he's always doing pro-veteran stuff. And he even did I think he openly came out in support of Trump. He definitely did events with Trump. And he's considered a very conservative actor. Mark Harmon, on the other hand, is a very typical Hollywood liberal, even though he looks like a Chad. But he makes in this article is that what's the difference is that Gary Sinise was actually a theater kid, and his parents were artists and in the art scene, while Mark Harmon was a great quarterback for UCLA in the 1970s, and one of his parents was a Heisman Trophy winner. He's comes from a very athletic family, but they had very different politics. And he argued that this thesis is that how they exercise is Gary Sinise is very much into weightlifting and powerlifting, while Mark Harmon goes into long distance running and endurance training. And that may explain their politics. Even though Mark Harmon is a natural athlete and comes from an athletic family, he gravitates towards liberal politics, while Gary Sinise comes from a more artistic family due to the fact of his workout regimen, then that makes him more conservative. Maybe that's not necessarily true, but that is like an interesting perspective on how these politics change of some people, is that it depends. And if you really do look, I think like you have to get like some endurance training in. You have to do cardio. You can't just like all do weightlifting and no cardio, because cardio is important and endurance training is important, especially if you're in like a crisis situation and you got to run a lot. It's good to have that, that stamina, but at the same time, it does seem to lower testosterone, and it doesn't present the ideal physique either. If you're like running, you're not really building a ton of muscle, you're just staying thin. And, you have to work, you have to do weightlifting to, get that physique that is idolized by a lot of people on right-wing Twitter. So I think that would come down to, the differences in it. But I mean, as long as you're working out, it's better than the average person, regardless of what you're doing, whether running, cycling, or weightlifting. As long as you're working out, it's good. We need fitness. Don't just sit on home at your computer. Make sure you work out a lot, because the rest of society isn't working out, and you got to stay healthy, got to stay fit. And it's so important, and it's one great thing about right wing Twitter. It's that it's one of the few political Twitters that encourages people to self improve. While most political factions don't encourage self improvement, right wing Twitter does. It encourages people to read books, get smarter, get healthier, eat healthier, work out, and most people who wouldn't have otherwise been doing that stuff do that due to their contact with right-wing Twitter. So I think it makes people's lives a lot better. And hopefully your lives are also improved by highly respected IQ supplements that you should sign up for. But that is all that we have for this episode today. We should have an IQ supplement up Wednesday, even though I always say Wednesday, it usually comes out later. It's going to be on Wednesday, unless there's some catastrophe that occurs that delays me, but we'll have another IQ supplement out later this week. Make sure you sign up at highlyrespected.substack.com so you can listen in. And until next time, stay respected.